So we've been in this series called The Dilemma of Suffering. And I'm sure that all of you have been touched in one way or another by suffering. And if you haven't, get ready, you probably will. I'm going to share just a few things that I've seen personally as a part of my ministry. When I was 32, a long time ago, because I'm Jeff's age, yeah, I am a few months older, not many. Same year. But at 32, my best friend died of cancer. And he left behind his wife and 12-year-old. And I went and did his funeral twice. He was a youth minister, so I did it where he was being a minister. We did it for his church, and then we drove to Lubbock, where his father worked for Sunset International Bible Institute. He was over their extension school there, and we did another one at Sunset. I remember a lady named Vicky at my church in Oklahoma, and she was in her middle to upper 40s, and she got cancer and she died and left behind her two 20-year-old sons. Everybody handles things differently. When my 32-year-old friend was near his deathbed, Monica and I went and spent a week with him. And I wanted to talk about the end, but all he wanted to do was have fun. So we just had a great time. And we went home and he died a few days later. Vicky wanted to talk about it. She wanted to talk about heaven and death and her kids that she was living behind. I think a 19-year-old and a 20-year-old. She actually wrote them letters that I read to them at her funeral. It's the first time they heard those letters. Then I remember when I was a campus minister in Tucson, Arizona, we had left there, but a family that were dear friends and members, he lost his job and he was depressed about it. And one day he went hiking in Sabino Canyon and took a revolver and took his life. And he left two kids that were in college. They were about 20, 22, and his wife behind, and they were in shock. They couldn't understand it. I remember a couple in Irving, Texas, and they gave birth to a child, and they were told right from the get-go that he was severely impaired and his life span would be very short, and they would have to care for him their entire life, and they did. And what a wonderful example of love they were carrying for their child until he finally died. He lived a lot longer than they expected, I think, because of all the love that they gave to him. When I was 45, Monica and I had our young kids, and we were out camping, and I got a phone call. This was before cell phone signals were very good, and about the time we hit the highway, I had about 10 voice messages, and I thought, this can't be good. And I went to listen to them, and I got another phone call, and it was one of my best friends in Tucson to tell me that our best friend had just died in a motorcycle accident. And he had had a drinking problem. So the first thing I thought is he'd gone back to drinking. He said, no, he's still not drinking. He was still sober. He'd gone back to church, turned his life around. But a lady that was high on prescription drug pills with a suicide note next to her was impaired driving on a small 2-lane highway, and she veered into him, and he was riding his motorcycle for a Sunday afternoon ride after having lunch with his parents, and he died instantly. So life is tough, and I'm sure some of you have stories that you can tell. I've heard some of your stories since I've been here. And I think of the Bible, and there's stories of suffering, and there one more I want to add. My cousin, when he was 20, and he's quite a bit younger than me because my uncle got married at a later age in life, he kept drinking, wouldn't stop. One day he took 3 kids in his car out. He was intoxicated. He rode the car 20 times. Amazingly, 3 of them survived, but a 16-year-old died. He went to prison for 10 years. Now, the good news is he found God in prison, and he's out, and he's a dedicated Christian man and married, and they've adopted a child, and they're doing great. But life is full of things that will let you down, full of things that will surprise you, that will suck the life out of you. And in the Bible, we see some of these. We see King David, and we know that King David sinned with Bathsheba, and in Psalm 51, you hear him just pouring his heart out to God because he is suffering from his own sin, and they lost their first child together because of his sin. And then I think of the Apostle Paul, and he suffered just for being a Christian. And that was the main reason he suffered. And I want you to hear in 2 Corinthians 11, 23 through 28, just listen to what he went through for being a Christian.
Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. I am talking like a madman, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. 5 times I received at the hand of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers. In toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches.
You know, can you imagine what he went through? I get upset when I have to suffer for my own sins. This was for nothing he did except believe in Jesus Christ and try and live his life as a disciple of Christ. And he was flogged and tortured and just treated horribly, and eventually, we believe, killed because of his faith. And I look at the Bible, and it's full of people that suffered. I could spend a long time here. Job is an obvious one. And in Job, you have a mystery because Job doesn't know why he's suffering. We may know why, and it doesn't make a lot of sense sometimes to me why God would let him go through that. But Job has no idea why he's going through that suffering. He loses everything, his family, everything he owns. And so there's this suffering in life that sometimes we don't even understand. We can't make sense out of it. And the Bible makes room for people that model that type of suffering and model for us how to go through that suffering and model for us that life is still meaningful in spite of that suffering. And in Psalm chapter 44, 17 through 19 and verse 24, I want you to listen to this psalm of lament. Listen carefully to this.
All this has come upon us, though we have not forgotten you, and we have not been false to your covenant. Our heart has not turned back, nor have our steps departed from your way. Yet you have broken us in the place of jackals and covered us with the shadow of death. Why do you hide your face? Why do you forget our affliction and oppression?
He says, we haven't forsaken your covenant, but we feel like you've left us. And sometimes you feel like God's left you, and suffering puts people in a dark place. In this book, Waiting for God, Simone Weil, she's a French woman, writes an essay on the love of God and affliction. And she talks about some of the things that depression or suffering does to you. And one of them is it isolates you. When you suffer, a lot of times you withdraw from your social circles. You withdraw from people that you love. You feel like you aren't worthy. You want to hide and be alone. You don't want to be out with people. And sometimes, just to be honest with you, when you suffer, sometimes close friends will withdraw from you because they don't know what to say. They don't know how to relate to you, and so you end up isolated. And also she talks about implosion. And what happens sometimes when we suffer is we become self-absorbed. All we can think about is ourselves and the problems that we're going through and the things that we're dealing with, and our thoughts are constantly about ourselves. And they're negative thoughts, and we start spiraling downwards as we obsess over ourselves and our thoughts and our problems, and suffering just sort of takes over your life. Or sometimes there's this sense of doom. You just feel like everything good is over, that there's nothing good left for you, that all the good is gone and you're just waiting for the next bad thing to happen. And sometimes I think when that happens, we just give up. We just give up. Or we decide there's not hope for us, or we decide that we're comfortable living this way. Sometimes we get stuck in suffering and we can't get out. And another thing that happens is we become angry. Sometimes we're angry at ourselves. Sometimes we're angry at others. Some people get angry at God. Job, if you remember, got angry at God because he couldn't understand why this was happening to him. And so suffering is a true dilemma that we face in our lives. And I think of the ministry of Jesus, and Jesus came and we know he suffered with us. But listen to Isaiah 61 verse 1, which is a messianic prophecy. And listen to what it says about the ministry of Jesus.
The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound.
In Luke chapter 4, when he gets up in Nazareth, this is the scroll that he opens and reads in Isaiah. And he says, that's my ministry, is to minister to the brokenhearted, to free the oppressed, to help the blind to see again. Jesus came for us that are suffering. So if you're suffering, I have some good news for you. Jesus came for you. Jesus is here to minister to you and to help you. And he says this in Matthew 11, verse 28, about coming to him.
Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest.
Just come to Jesus, he says, and I will give you rest. And I don't know where you are right now in your life. You may not have any suffering. Maybe you know someone that's going through suffering, but I have been through suffering, and I'm going to tell you that nothing gave me more solace than to know that I could walk with Jesus through it, to know that he had gone before me and that he was there comforting me. And we, by the way, have the same mission that Jesus had. He calls us as Christians to suffer with others. He calls us to stand beside them, to encourage them, and to comfort them. And that's what we're called to do, is to comfort the sufferer. John Feinberg, he is a professor of systematic theology, and he got the news that his wife had a terminal illness. Now, it was going to be quite a few years before she died, but she would never recover. There was no cure from this. And then to compound the situation, they found out that it was genetically transferable. And when they had kids, she might transfer this disease to their kids. And he talks about his own suffering. He talks about people who came and tried to comfort him and help him. And he said, so many people did not help me. He said, right when I found this out, somebody came and said, well, at least you know what she's going to die from. Another person came to him and said, well, you know, now that you know, you can prepare. We're all going to die from something. You can get ready for it. Another person came and said, well, God's going to make this work out good in your life. Y'all are going to be able to minister to people and do some good things. And I've heard that in the middle of my suffering. And when you're in the middle of your suffering, you don't really want to hear those things, just to be honest with you. There will be a time and a place, but it's not now. And so it's important that we understand that to comfort someone sometimes is just to be there with them. When I went to see my 32-year-old friend, I wanted to talk about things. He just wanted to be with me. And that was enough for him. You know, and there's this great story in 1 Kings 18 through 19. So Elijah goes and has this confrontation with all the prophets of Baal, and he calls them all to a mountain. There's 450 of them. And he has them prepare their sacrifice. And he says, you call your God to bring fire down on the sacrifice. You can't do your own fire. And I'll call my God, and let's see who is serving the real God. And they cut themselves and scream and yell and get all bloodied, and the fire never comes. And then just to prove his point, if you remember, Elijah pours water upon water upon water on his sacrifice and drenches it, and there's a puddle of water around it. And then he calls God to send the fire, and it comes and it burns the whole thing up. And all the people repented and said, we need to follow the God of Elijah, the God of Abraham and Isaac. And then what happens is he killed all the 450 prophets. He had them killed. Now, here's the interesting thing that happens after this story. It sounds like a great success. But look at what happens. In chapter 19 and verse 1, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, how he had killed the prophets with the sword. And then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. So she threatens his life. She said, because you killed all our prophets, we're going to kill you. And then look what it says in verse 3. Then he was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. And then he went on into the wilderness and sat down by a broom tree. Now, I'd like to sit down and say, Elijah, what's wrong with you, buddy? God just helped you kill 450 prophets. What is wrong with you? And it says that he sat down by this tree, and look at what he says. It's enough now, O Lord. Take away my life. I am no better than my fathers. He laid down and asked God to kill him. Now, talk about a guy that was a little manic depressive. He just won this great battle, and they destroyed 450 prophets of Baal. Now he's worried he's going to lose his life. He's hiding, and he's depressed. And I would say, Elijah, come on, wake up. Let's put some water in your face. Did you forget what just happened? Where's your courage? God's with you. But that's not what happens. Listen to what happens. This is what God does. He sends him an angel. And the angel touches him and said, arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones in a jar of water. And he ate and drank, and he lay down again. That's all. He just fed him. And then he wakes up again, and the angel comes a second time and says, arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. And he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. He said, hey, you need to eat. You're going to have to walk for 40 days to Mount Horeb. All he does is feed him, and he's there with him. That's it. I'd be chewing him out, reminding him about what God did. But he knew that the only thing he needed was food and presence. And sometimes that's the only thing that someone needs. Now, here coming up pretty soon, he's going to get confronted, but in the right place, at the right time, in the right manner, God is going to pull him back and remind him he's still with him, and he has more work to do. But sometimes people just need us to be there with them. Here's something written by a man who lost 3 sons, and it's called The View from a Hearse. I was sitting, torn by grief. Someone came and talked to me of God's dealings, of why it happened, of hope beyond the grave. He talked constantly. He said things I knew were true. I was unmoved, except to wish he'd go away. He finally did. Another came and sat beside me. He didn't talk. He didn't ask leading questions. He just sat beside me for an hour or more, listened when I said something, answered briefly, prayed simply, left. I was moved. I was comforted. I hated to see him go. Sometimes we just need to be with people. And we need to be comfortable with grief and comfortable with people that are hurting. I remember one of the first things that I had to do when I became a minister was a funeral, and I wasn't very comfortable with funerals. But I learned to be comfortable with funerals because I learned that that was the best way I could be Jesus to someone else, was just to be there with them and to sit with them in the midst of the suffering that they were going through. And sometimes say nothing, but just be there with them. Now, I don't know that we're real comfortable with grief. I don't know that there's the type of room in church for lament that there ought to be. This book here, written by Ron Ritgers, is about the Reformation of suffering, and it's about the Reformation and how they viewed suffering back in the medieval times. And he says that the Lutherans were afraid that if people started wailing and getting mad at God, that these people would be doubting God and not trusting God. So literally, the Lutherans taught their members that they shouldn't mourn, they shouldn't lament, they shouldn't get mad. Instead, they were taught the following: to face their suffering with unflinching acceptance and to show joy no matter what they were going through. Now, I know that's extreme, but I wonder sometimes about how we help people mourn at church. Where's it modeled? Where does it happen? I can't tell you how many times I've been in an office and some people maybe are crying, and guess what? The first thing happens when people start crying. Kleenex, dry them up quick. And we don't mean to send that message, but I think we do. Don't hurt. Make those tears go away. We feel like we need to fix it and get rid of the tears, but we learn from the Bible that you have to allow time for people to lament. You have to allow that lament to go on. And don't assume, by the way, just because you're a Christian and you are following God, that you won't face times of difficulty and suffering in your life. If you haven't, you will. And when you do, you need to make room in your life for lament. Listen to Psalm 88, 6 through 7, 13 through 14, and 18, which is a psalm of lament. And 18 is the last verse in the psalm, just so you know. Listen to this carefully.
You have put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions dark and deep. Your wrath lies heavy upon me, and you overwhelm me with all of your waves. But I, O Lord, cry to you. In the morning my prayer comes before you. O Lord, why do you cast my soul away? Why do you hide your face from me? You have caused my beloved and my friend to shun me. My companions have become darkness.
So, by the way, it starts bad and it ends bad. There's no silver lining in that psalm of lament. But here's the interesting thing. God doesn't censor those. He leaves them in the Bible. He doesn't rip those pages out. He leaves in the Bible examples of people that lamented. And in Job's case, if you remember, he gets angry at God. He questions God. He challenges God. Now, at the end in chapter 42, verses 1 through 6, after God comes and shows himself, reveals himself to Job, Job repents and says, hey, I'm sorry, I know nothing. I'm about this small in your creation, and I should have trusted you, and I repent. But then he goes and talks to Eliphaz, one of his friends, who Job, by the way, in chapter 16, verse 2, called miserable comforters, because they were telling him that he was at fault for all his suffering. And he goes and tells Eliphaz, unlike Job, who has spoken correctly about me, you have not, because you put an extra burden on him. But Job, the one who questioned God and got mad at God and challenged God, he said, spoke correctly about me. God understands that we have mixed emotions sometimes. He understands that we have to get those out. He understands that we have to work through what's going on in our life. And so you're not supposed to leave it stuffed inside. In fact, it's a spiritual principle. And by the way, when you find things that therapists or other people use that work, counselors, it's because they've discovered a spiritual principle. They've discovered how God created us and what works. And they know, therapists, that there's this spiritual principle that if you don't grieve, you don't get over your loss. And I'm sure you've heard this before. And I've had people tell me I'm worried because I have someone in my family that isn't grieving. And they've learned from years of research that when you don't grieve, you hang on to things and you don't completely get healed. And they learned that part of the process is denial and then anger inside and anger outwardly. And then sometimes it's bargaining. They try and bargain with God, and eventually you get depressed. And finally, if you work your way through it, you learn to accept it and to heal. And we know that God is the great healer. But we also know just from our own therapist and our own observation of nature and from the Bible that if we don't grieve and give it to God, we get to keep it. If you don't let it out, you hold on to it. If you don't express it, you get to hang on to that. And the Bible says you need to make room for lament in your life. But then we have to remember that everything happens in God's timing. It takes a while sometimes to get through the pain and suffering that you're in. In fact, as I think about this, one good thing to remember is if you're going through suffering, be gentle with yourself. It doesn't happen like this. You can't tell somebody, come on, snap out of it. It takes time. So give yourself time to grieve and to go through this process as you struggle with God to get somewhere. Tim Keller, in his book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, says that you have to be open to it. But when you're finally open to it, it's like dropping a piece of radioactive advice into a person that goes in there. It might be one line or one thing that they read or one thing that they see or one thing that they experience, and it goes in there, and all of a sudden it starts moving them and changing them and affecting them, and it slowly shrinks the tumor of pain and suffering. God will shrink that pain. Whether you get out of your circumstances or not, God can still heal you. But it happens in His timing. And I've learned this. I've learned that sometimes you can live right and go through a long period of darkness, but God's still there with you. I've also learned that sometimes in your deepest darkness is the best opportunity you have to kick Satan out of your life once and for all. Because what happens when you're going through darkness and things aren't turning out the way you hoped they would, that's when you're under the greatest temptation from Satan to turn away from God. And if you can withstand that moment, you're now not serving God for what He can give you. You're now not serving God selfishly, but you're serving God because God is God and you trust Him with your life. And so sometimes when you get through that deep darkness, it can be the one thing that saves you, and it can be the one thing that gets evil out for good. And so the other thing that I realize is that God uses darkness in so many ways in our lives. And we've talked about this. It's been sort of a theme of this series, is God takes what's bad and turns it around for good. In Hebrews 13, verse 5, He makes this promise to us. Listen carefully.
Keep your life free from love of money and be content with what you have. For He has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you.
God will never leave us. I want you to listen to, we've been showing some videos by Joni Eareckson Tada, who, as you know, when she was a young woman at 17, was paralyzed, became a quadriplegic. And she has had to live with pain and suffering her whole life. Listen to some of her words of wisdom.
I remember I was a little girl and seeing these old women in church who would talk about how sweet the Savior was, and I think, okay, I guess old people talk that way. But of all the things I've learned about Him, He is so sweet, and He's so lovely, and He is so worth knowing. He's ecstasy beyond compare. And I would much rather be in this wheelchair knowing I'm like that than to be on my feet without Him. Honestly, I would.
If I would, I'd like to quote just a short poem that has meant a great deal to me.
Please do. That's great.
When I was in the hospital, a friend of mine shared with me a particular hymn, and it's, abide with me, fast falls the evening tide. When darkness deepens, Lord, with me abide. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, help of the helpless, oh, abide with me. I think that kind of sums it up, too, just about how I feel that I can abide in the Lord's grace, even in this wheelchair. And that constantly amazes me, that, my goodness, I feel His sustaining power every day, and it just underscores to me that God can empower anyone to rise above their circumstances.
I get blown away when I listen to her talk, because in spite of what she went through, she's held on to Jesus her whole life, and she's still holding on strong. Reminds me of this verse in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13. Listen to this.
But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope.
So don't forget that some people have already died and gone on before you, and they're in their rest waiting for the second coming of Jesus to culminate everything. Don't forget that those who have already gone on before you died with their hope in Jesus, those who were Christians, and they are now victorious, and we're headed the same direction with them. And so he reminds us that we don't suffer like the rest of the world does because we have this hope of Jesus in our life. We have the comfort of Jesus walking with us, one who already went through this pain and is more than happy to walk with us through ours as well, and promises hope someday in heaven. And that's the one thing I want you to know out of this. And we're going to move next week into talking about the battle that goes on in your mind. But you can know this, that with Jesus, you have everything you need. Let's stand and sing.